One, two, three. Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin, and my guest today is a lifelong friend. It's Tom Hartley, who nearly everyone will know. But they mightn't know the diversity of the work that Tom Hartley is involved in. Just let me explain to you that Scéalta is a product of Fáilte Appears to Hear and Féile. So Féile and Fáilte Appears to Hear are the co-producers of the Scéalta program. So, Tom, thank you for taking time out. How are you doing? How are you managing with the lockdown?
Well, I think I'm okay, Joe. One never knows these days, but I'm looking after myself and doing a bit of training. I try and do a daily walk, okay? And essentially, I suppose I haven't been out of the house now for over a month, uh, other than for, say, a walk. And, so
you probably heard in the intro there that I was trying to describe you in many ways. You know, you are a political activist, you're an ex-prisoner, you're former Lord Mayor, you of course were a very active councillor in the Beachmount area particularly, you're an author, you're a best-selling author. So with all of those hats and all of those labels, how do you describe yourself?
Well, first of all, I see myself very much rooted in my community. I was born in Harrogate Street, off Cavendish Street, in a two up and two down. I was shaped by that house. I was shaped by that street and the community I came from. And in essence, I very deliberately orientate myself in everything I do. I orientate myself towards that upbringing, that sense of community, that sense of belonging to a village, a very small village at the time, you know, the Falls, and to understand from and my deep sense of connection to that.
I find that a wee bit of not a contradiction, but a wee bit strange perhaps. Well, you are very much, and I know you're very, very proud of the Harrogate Street and the Cavendish Street area and where you came from. And I want to take you to one of the first things you've done when you became mayor, which I think is a testimony as to where your loyalties lie. But in later life, you were very much a pioneer of the outreach strategy that was developed within the nationalist community and developed within Sinn Féin in particular. So maybe if you start off by you explaining the story. You've just became Lord Mayor. You've got a fairly fancy car. You come from this working class background. You're probably one of the first truly working class people to be the Lord Mayor or the Mayor of Belfast. So the Cavendish Street, Harrogate Street function that you undertook. Tell us about that.
Well, the very first thing, it was the morning after I was elected to the position of Lord Mayor of Belfast. I made it a point of getting into the car and getting the car. So I drove up to Harrogate Street, knocked the door of Mrs. MacDonald, who was the next door neighbour of my mother, and said, "Come on, get into the car." Then I talked to another neighbour, Belle Tolan, and said, "Come on, get into the car." Belle, of course, said, "I can't get into the car." And I says, "Why not?" And she says, "I haven't got my teeth in." So, but eventually they got into the car. So I drove them around the district in the Lord Mayor's car. So, but I think what I was really doing was saying that my very first act as a mayor was to make that connection. And even though and I come from Harrogate Street and I've travelled quite a bit and I've seen the world and I have an internationalist view of society, I nevertheless, my very first act was to again reorientate myself towards Harrogate Street to remind myself of who I represented. The working class communities of Belfast were a very important part of my life, and as mayor, I was, just going back to that. So I think that's the story of my very first act as the Lord Mayor of Belfast.
I have a slightly different reading of that. I think that not only was that a kind act and a nice act and a funny act, I think that was you nailing your own colours as the mayor, Lord Mayor, to the mast. That you, as you say there, that you're very much a Lord Mayor, a mayor for everyone, but particularly that grouping in society that you came from. So just to follow on that theme, born and bred in Harrogate Street, what school did you go to?
I went to St. Gall's, just behind Clonard Monastery. And then I went to St. Thomas's. I left St. Thomas's at the age of 15. And, I think since then, I always said to myself, I became a local boy made bad after that. I left. I have no letters to my name. I'm very unlettered. My first job was as a message boy, which I stuck for a few years. I ended up in London for a while with BEA, and came back, and the rest is history. 1969 was a very defining moment for me, and so the rest is my public persona, I suppose, from then on.
Was there any indication at school? I know that most young people of that age and of that time, the last thing they were looking to do was to be formally educated. But was there any indication that within you there was a writer trying to get out?
No, but I tell you what, because I was thinking about this the other day. In my work around burial grounds, the very first thing I always do is to create a map. And the purpose of creating a map is to essentially have in my head every detail of the burial ground. So I walk it, I photograph it, and then along with a designer, I sit down and help design the map that I want of that burial ground and the information that I want to put into that map. So I've done it for Milltown, I've done it for City Cemetery, Balmoral Cemetery. I've done it now for Friars Bush and the Clifton Street cemeteries. And going back to St. Thomas's, I remember the art teacher in St. Thomas's giving us a project to do something. And I actually did a plan, an outline of the school, a plan of the school. And really, I was thinking about this the other day. So at a very early age, I was interested in maps, and even old maps. I love old maps. I love the information that you can extrapolate from a map. It's really amazing. But there was a sign of something that I, of course, didn't do anything about until I started to develop an interest in cemeteries. And it has really taught me so much, the idea of a map, because I think we all have maps in our head, and to know, so we know how to get from the bottom of the Glen Road to Royal Avenue, so we have it in our heads. And so that was a reminder of an interest that I didn't even realize at the time would emerge 50, 60 years later.
I just want to say this to have it noted, that one of the loves of your life, one of the passions of your life that people may not be aware of is music. You have
Yes.
a love of music, and I know that with the revival of the Irish traditional music in the late 60s, you were very much involved in that in the Belfast area, and you're a very accomplished, some would say wonderful, bodhrán player.
Well, not anymore, but in the 60s, of course, I developed this love of Irish music, never lost it. And I used to go to the Flaciols. There was a crowd in Belfast, in orbit around Pat's Bar. And we would go to the Flaciols. And I remember, I think it was somewhere in the mid-60s, I saw my first drum, my first bodhrán at a Flaciol. I came back to home then from and 6 weeks later, I had made my very first drum, and I made a number of them in the 70s. I still got two of drums at home. I developed at the time, the pin for playing the drum. So I
Yeah.
developed it to my style to help me uh, better play the drum. So, but I haven't. While my love of Irish music's continued down the years, I haven't played a bodhrán in yonks. And in fact, about 2 or 3 Christmases ago, I was in a competition with a son of my niece who is also playing the bodhrán, and I have to say he humiliated me. Uh,
You have his
you
name and
know,
address, Tom, and we'll sort him out. I
yes,
have one of your borons.
yes.
You've made me a boron, which I have to say I've treasured, and I have it now probably about 30 years.
It must be more, Joe.
Probably is, Tom. I want to kind of skip because we don't have a whole lot of time, believe it or not.
Yes.
I want to get a flavour of yourself, of the man. And I mentioned there that you have the passion for music and all of that. Of course, you're renowned as a political activist. You were the general secretary of Sinn Féin at a time of great political turmoil on the island of Ireland and great change within Sinn Féin. So looking back on that period, and I have to say that a lot of these things that you were renowned for, you were quite a young person when these were taking place. So that period, that kind of trying to manage the growth of a political party, trying to move people forward. Of course, you were part of a collective leadership. How difficult was that?
Well, of course, the circumstances were very, very difficult at the time. Uh, but nevertheless, I like to say I have seen the promised land. And what I mean by that is, that I've arrived at the promised land. What I mean by that, I think through the dedication and commitment of many hundreds of individuals, and they're looking after us at the time and helping us and supporting us. So while it was a difficult time, it was also a time of seeing people, in my view, in terms of their support for the party, seeing them at their best. And so while it was difficult in terms of organization, I met great people at the time. I got to know the back roads of Ireland, which oddly enough, myself and Jim Gibney appreciated. So I was able to, while doing my political work, I along with Jim McAllister and Jerry Adams at the time, we walked the over Slieve Gullion. I visited the Cooley Mountains. I was in Kerry. I was in the Ringgailtock in the southeast of the country. I was in Donegal, and it gave me a great sense of getting to know the country of my birth. The back roads, and so it wasn't all. It was, while it was difficult, it was also very important for me in terms of, as I said, the people I met, the places I visited, the homes I stayed in, the people who looked after me. You think in terms of political party just as a structure, a political structure, which it is, with endless meetings, and but it's much more than that. To me, it was a really while difficult, but it was really important. Give me a sense of Ireland.
You mentioned earlier on that you, at heart, are an internationalist and have an idea and a fraternity for other struggles that are ongoing throughout the world. And many of the sites that we take for granted in the west of the city, in particular at the moment, hordes of tourists on the couched tours or the black taxi tours and all of that, you were actually instrumental in developing that concept of revolutionary or political tourism. But tell us how your involvement with that, how that began.
Well, it seems to me, of course, that I suppose coming from a community, because of course I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and soon realized, if you're not seen, you're not heard. So all my life, it is about not just seeing, but hearing communities and, hearing the narrative of, what people have to say about themselves. I think that is so essential to people who are involved in politics. And that has it has, in a sense, a local dimension to it, but it's also got an international dimension to it. So as a young kid, for instance, I remember going to a meeting about the Vietnam War. Of all places in Albert Bridge Road, it was the headquarters of the Communist Party of Belfast, and they held a meeting on the Vietnam War, and so I attended that meeting. I knew from a kid, and I don't know how I knew, but I knew about Nelson Mandela, okay, and the struggle in South Africa. I knew at the time, of course, there was a struggle in Algeria, and so, all this framed what was then termed as an anti-imperialist outlook in terms of politics, So I saw myself, in the context of knowing about other people's struggles, the civil rights struggle in the United States were all a part of my upbringing. And they were the foundations of a view of me being connected to the larger world outside of the Falls Road. And we followed those struggles. So, we read books like, by, say, Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, Albert Memmi. So we were very much saw ourselves in that political context. So we didn't see just see our life or our community or our struggle in the context of what was happening on the Falls Road. We placed it in an internationalist perspective.
You mentioned your first act as Belfast mayor was to go back, I think, not only symbolically, but from a point of view of grounding yourself. That's my reading of it. But you also, from day one, were quite strident in your outreach within the Loyalist Unionist Protestant community, something that you've kept with you today, this very day. So was that a conscious decision, or was it dictated by the job or by the office of mayor, or did you not only say I'm a mayor for everyone, you obviously meant it? So was it something that you decided to do from day one?
Well, I think at one level it's a very conscious thing, to recognize that I often think that those of us who say we are non-sectarian have to guard against being sectarianized by this society. And in my background, I have uncles Republicans and uncles who say we're in the British Navy. My grandfather on my mother's side was in the British Army. So politically, I have often seen the mix in my family as really reflective of the complexity of the society that I was born into. And over the years, I think I've tried to develop that sense of me as a part of a layered, complex, and often difficult society, where there are difficult issues that need to be addressed. So for me, as an individual, my history isn't one-dimensional. There are different layers to my identity. I often say being a heretic, bit of a heretic, all my life I've lived inside the British state. Now, I may not like that, but at least I have to recognize that in a way has shaped me. And I'm often intrigued about how it does shape me. So, for instance, You and I think the health service today is a brilliant organization doing a brilliant job, but we always
Absolutely.
felt that. We always
Yeah.
felt that. We had that sense of, but that the health service was created by an act of the British Parliament. So we have to recognise that there are things in our life which shaped us, which give us a particular view of the world that we lived in. And so when I come to, and the more, I remember making sense of my life one day when suddenly I discovered that my grandfather, David Nelson, was a Presbyterian. Suddenly I understood that argumentative, contrary part of me, you know, uh, that for years,
I couldn't possibly comment on that, but go on.
so, that sense of what we bring, each of us brings to this society. So I feel enhanced by the complexity of the society I was born in. I feel enhanced by being neighbours, the Falls and the Shankill and the Donegal Road, big working class communities with often very different world views, but nevertheless, I think they're great people, all of them. And I think it's very important for us in the political sphere to recognise that and to recognise how important it is that history doesn't go along parallel lines, and neither do the stories of individuals.
I want to take you to where you are today with 10 minutes left of the interview. But let me just remind those who have joined us, you're listening to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. My guest today is my friend, is Tom Hartley. And we have kind of wandered down parts of his life. We haven't done justice to any of it. The time is too short. And Scéalta is a product of Phil and Uri and also Phil and Fubble. So that's where we are. And also, of course, Vulture Fears to Hear. Can I just kind of bring you on to the obvious on-top skill that you discovered of being a very competent, a very good writer. How did that develop, or was it always there?
Well, it must have been always there. Although writing is a skill that you just need to, in a sense, I don't think, for me anyway, I haven't reached the point where I can say with a great deal of confidence that I'm a good writer. You're always learning something. Uh, it's always important for your material to be, particularly when you're, say, writing a book, to be read by others, because it's amazing. I mean, one of the fundamental lessons that I learned, particularly about research, is how often the eye can tell you a lie. So, for instance, I might be looking at a headstone with the name Irvine on it and write down Irwin. The eye assumes. And so all these wee tricks, word blindness, you pick up in time. And the most basic lesson, of course, is you have to keep doing it, doing it, doing it, doing it again to write. But I've become something of a research junkie in my old age. I will search for just a wee nugget of information in books and on the old computer and in libraries. I've got that sort of obsessive need now sometimes to link together someone's life by just one piece of small information. And I really, really enjoy that. And, it brings new dimensions of understanding, I think, both reading and writing. And particularly, in the present crisis, where I'm researching now all the burial grounds of Belfast. So that's really important for me. It's, to keep moving and keep trying to understand the history of the city.
Of course, I think it's fair to say that, particularly the city cemetery, which was your first big project,
Yes.
if it hadn't been documented by yourself, there was a real danger that it would be lost. That information, and I've often heard you describing graveyards really as the eyes of a city, the soul of a city.
Well, of course, if you think about it, what you find in a graveyard is, the story of a city through the individuals who are buried there. And often it's not just the story of the city, it's the story of a country, it's the story of the world, it's the story of epochs, it is the story of the poor, the rich, the religious, the drunkards, the whole gambit of society, and is found in the narrative of a burial ground. And I think it's very fundamental to human beings to explore that narrative, because in a way, when a graveyard is like a bridge that we cross into the lives of those who are buried there, and there's so much to be found out. So what has surprised me about burial grounds is, oddly enough, I often say to people, I know history can be quite cruel, and the great and the good today, what I've noticed is the great and the good of years and years and years ago, within 30 or 40 years, they'd been forgotten about, So, and then, of course, working people, you don't see much of them. You don't see much of women. The poor, you're not meant to see. They don't even have headstones. Working people, as I said, while there are those with large headstones and who often can wax lyrical about themselves through inscription, but there are really, really amazing lives to be discovered when you start to look at the history of a burial ground, and it's always complex.
Of course
So,
it is. But
you have
the style of writing that you've perfected makes it complex but quite enjoyable.
well,
Following in the city, there was Milltown, and then of
yes,
course was the Balmoral.
yes,
And I
Balmoral.
was sorry,
Go ahead.
I was there the night of the launch in St. Mary's, surrounded by Presbyterians,
Yes.
surrounded by the leadership of the Presbyterian Church and different elements of it. And they made the point that that history of their community was almost gone. It almost had been lost. And they identified the book as a way of regenerating interest. Was that part of the motivation behind the writing of that book? Was it to preserve or to entertain?
First of all, Joe, the way I see it is that's our history. The history of Presbyterianism, it's the history of our city. And it's my history, and it's your history. And that's why I mean, fighting against this idea of how we are sectarianized, seeing someone else as different, whereas in fact, Presbyterians who have shaped Belfast, shaped the politics of Belfast, and in fact, Presbyterians shaped our politics, being as Republicans. So it's our history, and when I started to look into it, I knew very little about Presbyterianism. And of course, when I started to look into it, I came across non-subscribers, subscribers, Covenanters, Seceders, New Light, Old Light. I came across so many variations of Presbyterians, which all added to, I think, the sense of the complexity of Presbyterianism in Belfast. And the other thing I noticed was this here. I started to notice there are meeting houses which had disappeared. So in the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, Presbyterians had created 66 congregations in Belfast. They had built over 100 meeting houses. But importantly, they'd also built about 80 schools. And so, and this is the power of the burial ground. So when I looked at Roran Hannah, his church, you would have known it, Joe, St. Enoch's, Carlisle Circus.
Yeah.
When he built that church, the amazing thing I found about him was that he built 6 schools. Now, I think Hannah, from a nationalist community perspective, they look at his life in a very particular way. And yet here I found a fact that really run up against my early knowledge of the man. So he was interested in education and built 6 schools, mostly in North Belfast. So I just think there's so much that Presbyterians have brought to this city. our city. That it really, when I opened the gates, I talk about opening the gates of Balmoral, that I opened a vista of a history, a dynamic history, a creative history. But unfortunately today, Presbyterianism, for instance, has all but disappeared in North and West Belfast. They're still there, but in very reduced congregations. And we should at least be worried about that, to say, you know, um, that's not good for our city. Whatever we think about people of different religious views, or even holding religious views, uh, the loss of the Presbyterians, to say, but if you think about it, when I was growing up, there was a Presbyterian church in Albert Street, there was Broadway, there was Norfolk, not Norfolk, the Suffolk, there was one in Suffolk. Vere Foster School, the Henry Taggart, that was started off, built as an extension of Nelson Memorial. They're all gone now. And I think we need to lament that. We need to say, we need to actually say, we're looking forward to the day when Presbyterians can come back to worship on the Falls Road.
We have run out of time. I'm sorry to say. The whole chunks of your activity, which we haven't covered. We haven't covered, for instance, your involvement with the Lynn Hall Library. I know you have a passion there. I know that there is a considerable body of work there named after your mother and father, and it's there. Yes, of course, in perpetuation. We haven't covered your latest project, so that gives me a good excuse to have you back on the program. If you'll come back on the program, you're quite difficult to get because I know you're very much in demand. So, on behalf of Scéalta, on behalf of Film Fubble, and on behalf of False Fears to Hear, can I thank you for being my guest? Can I ask you to continue the work on all of our behalf? And can I say, Baramila Mayogat?
And Joe, can I just thank you, because as you know, Dan, in the long history that you and I share together, I've had my moments. You know that. At times I can be quite forthright, not very often, but at times. But can I just acknowledge that one of the great generous souls that has been on my journey is yourself. I've never saw you in any way other than through your generosity, and it really is a pleasure and an honor to have you on that great journey of my life, or that whatever journey of my life. But thank you, Joseph.
What a way to end the program, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joe.